Hey, I'm Dr. Samuel Alexander, mathematician and philosopher, and I'm going to be reading the memorial article on Nigel Boston, 1961 to 2024, written by Jordan Ellenberg and Judy L. Walker and published in 2025 in the notices of the AMS. Nigel Boston, who died on March 31st, 2024 at the age of 62, was a friend, a mentor, and an inspiration to the two of us and to many other people in mathematics, as the long list of testimonials following this introduction will make clear. We're very lucky to have had him as part of our community. From JLW, Nigel and I arrived at Illinois at the same time. He as a tenure-track assistant professor and I as a first-year graduate student. Nigel was the first faculty member I met other than the professors for my courses and the first one I had a real conversation with. I started working with him that summer, becoming his first PhD student before I was really ready to start being someone's PhD student. I learned not just mathematics from him, but so many values that have permeated my approach to my career to this day, from running an interactive, active learning classroom to the importance of contributing to the profession in ways other than research, to mentoring graduate students in ways that recognize that they are individuals with lives outside of mathematics. I am profoundly grateful for the opportunity to have learned from him. With Nigel's passing, the mathematics community lost not just an outstanding researcher, but also an outstanding human being. From JSE. I came to Wisconsin in 2005 as a new assistant professor and found Nigel an invaluable mentor both as a mathematician and as a person. Mathematically, he taught me that interesting mathematics was more likely to be found by working on what idiosyncratically moved you than by working on what the general consensus considered the thing to be doing. Oh, my goodness, I wish more people had this philosophy. And watching Nigel work with his huge crowd of students and postdocs was how I learned how to guide a young mathematician without commanding. I wouldn't be the mathematician I am without him. Nigel grew up in England and studied at Manchester Grammar School, founded in 1515, where he excelled in Latin and Greek but surprised his tutors by choosing to specialize in mathematics instead. He did his undergraduate work at Cambridge. He then went on to Harvard for graduate school, where he worked with Barry Mazur. He arrived at an opportune time, the dawn of the theory of deformations of Galois representations. As Nigel put it, when I went to grad school, nobody did number theory. However, I found I could solve some questions in it by applying group theory. I still do that as my style of research. And indeed, Nigel's number theory was always shot through with group theory, from his work on arboreal representations, Galois representations rising in arithmetic dynamics whose image lies in the automorphism group of an infinite tree, to his collaboration with Michael Bush and Farshid Hajir on the problem of understanding the maximal unramified pro-peak Galois groups of number fields. One of Nigel's most firmly held mathematical beliefs was that, contrary to the popular belief that finite groups are simple groups stuck together, the richest and most interesting part of group theory is the pro-p part. After Harvard, Nigel did postdoc work at IHES and at Berkeley before taking on his first faculty appointment at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he spent 12 years. One of the gentlemen on my dissertation committee worked at UIUC. From there, he moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he spent the remainder of his career until his retirement in 2019, with brief sojourns to explore named chairs at the University of South Carolina and at University College Dublin. He was an astonishingly generous and prolific mentor, overseeing 15 PhD theses at Illinois and 24 at Wisconsin. That latter number is tied for ninth most among all professors in the history of the UW-Madison Math Department, and Nigel did it in just 17 years. To be sure, not all of Nigel's mentoring and research was in pure mathematics. His appointment at Wisconsin was half in math and half in electrical engineering, and of those 24 grad students, 7 were engineers. And Nigel's two halves weren't intellectually separated. He showed again and again that ideas from algebra were relevant to real engineering problems, and that those problems in turn could be sources of ideas of real interest to pure mathematicians. Interdisciplinary research, very close to my heart. Nigel said that nowhere comes close to UW in terms of multidisciplinary cooperation between different departments, but he was too modest to say that this was in large part due to his own tireless efforts to promote engagement between mathematicians, computer scientists, and engineers. His intellect, generosity, and warmth will be missed by his colleagues and friends around the world. It came as a surprise to his fellow mathematicians when Nigel retired in 2019, since he was still producing so much great mathematics. But Nigel's priorities were always very clear. His family came first. He got to spend almost 5 years of retirement in sunny Florida with his beloved Susan, and in every interaction with him his unmixed joy at being able to do that was clear. It was one more wise choice in a life marked by wisdom. Barry Mazur. Nigel Boston was a delight and an illuminating presence, and he was so from the earliest days that I knew him. I was his PhD thesis advisor. The sheer pleasure he had in thinking mathematics and the strongly original take he had on any question he considered were already quite visible in his thesis. And the inspiring span of his interests, a vast panoply of publications ranging from his work on 3D human face recognition to his work on Galois deformations, non-abelian Cohen-Lenz heuristics, on coding, cryptography, and to his wonderful range of expository offerings, e.g. a tailor-made plug for Wiles proof, is a blessing to our scientific community, a seemingly effortless Archimedes-like reach that he had as he contributed to the fast-moving developments in both applied and pure mathematics. He approached his mathematical writings with an aura of playfulness that makes it such fun, as well as being important to read. For example, certain structures arising in a specific technical context he defined to be children. His generosity of spirit, his love of mentoring, and of being a friend and guide to students is a model for all of us. Well, I'm interested in this children part. I do a lot of mathematical biology research where I refer to children where I literally mean children. And his love for family radiated always. Once, in an official capacity, invited me to visit to give a lecture. Inviting me to visit to give a lecture, he started by saying, "You'll get to meet my two daughters," and as a by the way, he suggested that I give a lecture. The arithmetic statistics of P groups that are the Galois groups of maximally everywhere unramified field extensions of degree a power of P over fields Galois over the rationals of a fixed degree delta is one of the many themes pursued by Nigel. This is a natural continuation of the Cohen-Lenstra initiative of studying the arithmetic statistics of class numbers and the work of Y. Liu, M. Matchett Wood, and D. Zoraik Brown. Just before the pandemic, i.e. one of his last contributions to our subject, Nigel, together with M.R. Bush, posted a paper on arXiv studying the especially interesting case of cyclic cubic fields, i.e. delta equals 3, and two groups, i.e. P equals 2, and offering fundamental conjectures. How we all wish that Nigel were still here to continue his work with as many co-authors and to be his inspiring and cheerful self for all of us. Gebhard Bokel. I was one of Nigel's first two PhD students. It might have been the fall of 1992 when, as a graduate student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, I first got to know him. He was teaching a course on algebraic number theory. Or rather, we studied the textbook at home, and the class periods were problem-solving sessions on exercises from the book. Nigel must have continued to this experimental style because 1 or 2 semesters later I remember a course of his on elliptic curves which took place in a computer lab where we used an early version of GP-Pari to do all kinds of computations. These were exciting times because Nigel in 1993 brought back the news from Cambridge that Andrew Wiles had announced a proof of Fermat's last theorem, which, as we learned later, still needed some corrections by him and Richard Taylor. At the time, I was looking for some guidance. I had attempted some thesis projects before, but either they seemed too hard or were too easy. In this struggle, I asked Nigel to be my advisor, and it worked. He gave me some good directions. We had weekly meetings. I still remember his office in Antguild Hall, and by the summer of 1995 I had graduated. After I moved back to Europe, we still stayed in close contact, and I visited him in 2000 at Urbana-Champaign for several months, and often when I was in the U.S. for some research visit, he would invite me and offer some good advice. Nigel had a good sense of where interesting new research took place. I remember some discussions with him on a conjecture of de Jong when it had just appeared. This theme had an important impact on some of my later research. He also made me appreciate the use of pro-P Galois theory for local fields and number fields in the study of deformation rings and for representations of such groups, a method used in his explicit computations of such rings. Some years after my thesis, this led me to apply de Moskine groups to theoretically understand some local deformation rings. When in 2019 I learned that Nigel decided on an early retirement, I was happy for him, though with the many PhD students he usually had, I found it hard to believe. I wished him well. When I learned this Easter of his untimely death, it saddened me greatly. To me, Nigel had always been a mentor and colleague with a positive spirit for which I shall remember him. Bob Barmish. I first met Nigel Boston in the mid-1990s at the Allerton Conference on Communication, Control, and Computing. Within 1 minute, we recognized that we were on the same mental frequency. The discussion between Nigel, the applied mathematician, and Bob, the mathematical engineer, could not have gone better. As we strolled along the beautifully groomed park trails, it became rapidly apparent that it is not only our intellectual connection which is in play, I also liked Nigel as a human being. As we walked along, we discovered that we had a mutual interest in stability theory and the ramifications of Karatanov's theorem. Little did I know at that time that 7 years later Nigel would become my University of Wisconsin colleague and that his electrical and computer engineering office would be just 2 doors down from mine. Nigel and I became rather close colleagues over the 16 years that we were both at UW. During the first half of this time period, our interactions were dominated by discussions of his ongoing research and mine. I still have vivid memories of his insightful comments and the kind manner in which he expressed his thoughts when being critical of my work. What I particularly liked about his research style was the time he spent deciding whether a problem formulation was worthy of his undivided attention. Many of the problems which he addressed struck me as being fundamental, potentially important, nearly trivial to understand and difficult to solve. Of course, the best problems in math are those which are easy to understand and difficult to solve. I vividly remember the day Nigel explained his work aimed at finding a contestant's optimal strategy on the television show called The Weakest Link. After our fun experience discussing the big picture in his work, it was most enjoyable carefully reading the details in his paper. Thanks to Nigel the Motivator, we carried out some joint work aimed at generalizing his expected profit optimization problem to include consideration of the variance of profit as well. Given that this was our one and only jointly published paper, many years later we shared some good laughs reminiscing about how we prioritized having fun over productivity. I have some co-authors who we similarly prioritize things. Speaking of having fun, one of our most memorable technical interactions involved Nigel's fascination with the so-called Belgian chocolate stabilization problem. Given the control-theoretic nature of the formulation, I could immediately appreciate the potential difficulties which Nigel would need to address to make progress. Suffice it to say, I greatly enjoyed following Nigel's progress leading to his publication in collaboration with his graduate student Zachary Charles. Over the 15-year period that we were both at UW, a transformation occurred. We began as colleagues in 2002, with our discussions being almost entirely restricted to technical problems of an applied mathematical nature. With the passage of time, however, the departure from this protocol became more and more frequent. We found ourselves moving from having coffee in engineering hall to having cappuccinos in Madison cafes and discussing topics far outside the realm of applied mathematics. Before we knew it, we found ourselves going out for occasional dinners with our wives, Susan and Joan. So many wonderful memories. Nigel and I became emeriti at UW within a year of each other. By then, the friendship component of our relationship exceeded the professional component. The last time I saw Nigel in person was in 2019. Soon thereafter, Joan and I took our exit to a new chapter of life in Massachusetts, and Nigel and Susan's new chapter began in Florida. Starting in April 2020, we shared many thoughts about adaptation to COVID life, which included an ability to pursue previously planned out-of-home academic activities such as travel. One of my strongest memories of that period was my admiration of Nigel's glass-half-full approach to the dire situation at hand. While I was feeling that life had become topsy-turvy, I perceived Nigel to be rather upbeat and doing quite well working with the cards he was dealt. I sensed that Nigel and Susan were enjoying their new Florida life, which included biking and swimming on a daily basis. During our week-long email thread, I found the following particularly impressive. Despite how early it was in the pandemic, Nigel's creative mind was going full speed ahead working on new classes of mathematical problems motivated by the threat of COVID-19. Thanks to Nigel, our preoccupation with depressing thoughts about the pandemic had been transformed into having great fun discussing the technical details associated with any interesting new research problem. By the time calendar year 2024 rolled around, I was thinking that it was long overdue for us to spend some quality time in person with our friends Susan and Nigel. Maybe a trip to Florida? All things considered, perhaps the reader can imagine how shocked I was to learn of Nigel's sudden passing. He was too young to take a permanent leave of absence and was an outstanding human being who was creative, highly accomplished, and lots of fun. We'll all miss Nigel Boston. May he rest in peace. David Perry. Nigel Boston's curriculum vitae is still readily found online. I am ninth in the list of his PhD students on this CV, defending my thesis in the summer of 1999 at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Other contributors to this memorial will surely delve into the breadth and depth of his interests, of his service, of his penchant for collaboration. His CV encapsulates these things, but allow me to single out the following entry. Revision of Math 118, Quantitative Reasoning, and for Distance Learning, introduced new approach and led team of TAs. As a grad student, I enjoyed being part of the calculus reform initiatives at UIUC at the time. As a young teacher, I was not only interested in working with Nigel due to my own mathematical interests, but because he obviously cared about the state of mathematics education at all levels. He already embodied that when at the blackboard. He was one of many professors from whom I learned how important it is to write large, legibly, and with intentional organization, all force multipliers when he explained concepts and stepping through exercises. His desire to improve Math 118 and numeracy course intended for non-mathematics majors stemmed from this passion that is less overt on his CV, his passion for improving mathematical literacy outside of our bubble, his passion for training graduate students to be communicators and to always give thought to how we can improve our abilities as educators. I'm grateful for everything I learned by watching him and by working with him as a mathematician and as an educator. As an advisor, as a mentor, I was well served by Nigel and will always be grateful to him, hoping to have paid it forward. Sharon Brugman. Everyone reading this article knows what a brilliant mathematician Nigel was. I wish to remember him as a family man and kind-hearted mentor. I first met Nigel while I was attending the REU at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. I've published in the Rose-Hulman Undergraduate Mathematics Journal. He drove over to Terre Haute for the day to talk about graduate schools and, of course, to pitch the University of Illinois. Just a year later, I made the move to Champaign-Urbana for graduate school. The next time I saw Nigel was at the Get to Meet Your Fellow Graduate Students party. Nigel was welcoming to all the new students, as he often did at social events in those days. He had a baby daughter in his arms. One of the traditions at Illinois is number theory beer. That sounds fun. This weekly event was held in the evening at a bar. A few of his students didn't drink, and so he created number theory lunch. Here we students and Nigel got to know each other as friends. We talked about almost anything except math. I still laugh remembering the time he demonstrated the Macarena to those of us who were not culturally with it. Sometimes his wife Susan or his daughters would be with him. He created a connection between his family and his students. What made Nigel truly stand out as a kind-hearted mentor was how he encouraged me through times of adversity. My parents separated and divorced while I was his student. Nigel was my rock with his encouragement. When I failed my oral exam, he didn't set me aside. He urged me to forget about it, finish the semester, and then review over Christmas break. When the next semester started, he helped me practice and declared that I was ready. On the day of the oral exam, my watch battery decided to wear out. The format was for a committee to ask questions, which gradually got harder as you went along. After what appeared to be only 20 minutes, I started to miss questions, yet Nigel had this big ear-to-ear grin on his face. Honestly, his grin was upsetting at that moment, since I thought I'd failed again. It turned out I had been answering questions for a full hour before they stumped me, and Nigel's big grin was a sign that he was truly happy for me. Nigel was also there for other big events. When I got engaged to fellow student Jeff Brueggerman, Nigel was fabulously supportive. Judy Walker with Susan Boston's help threw me a small bridal shower, and for the wedding, Nigel and his whole family came to share in my joy. After he retired and moved to Florida, Jeff and I had the fortune of meeting him and Susan for lunch. It was wonderful to catch up and reminisce. In hindsight, I'm grateful he retired early. It allowed him the opportunity to devote those last 2 brief years to Susan. Ken Ono. I've spoken to Ken Ono at one of the ACMS conferences. Very interesting guy. Nigel Boston was a good friend and an extraordinary mathematician, and his death came as a major surprise. I owe him many debts, and it brings me deep sorrow that I will never thank him in person. I would not be a professional mathematician today had Nigel Boston and Andrew Granville not graciously conspired to launch my career that I thought was dead in the water. I met Nigel in 1993 when I was a brand new PhD full of doubt. I wrote a modest thesis at UCLA on modular forms, and I couldn't fathom that there might be a place for me in the world of mathematics. I had applied for 190 jobs in the fall of 1992, and by the following May I had not received a single offer. What? Ken Ono? That's very interesting. I was prepared to accept a position teaching in a local community college by the time while I figured out what I would do with my life. This is astonishing to read because Ken Ono is an extremely successful mathematician. Then an amazing thing happened. Andrew Wiles announced the proof of Fermat's theorem on June 23, 1993, and overnight it seemed like the whole world wanted to know about elliptic curves and modular forms. This sudden and unexpected interest in modular forms rescued me. I see. I went to the University of Georgia for a year to work with Andrew Granville, and it was Andrew who introduced me to Nigel the sponge, who seemed to know everything about arithmetic geometry and modular forms. Nigel was so kind, and he too was just getting himself established on the faculty at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I worked my butt off trying to impress Andrew and Nigel. When I was not renewed for a second year at the University of Georgia, Andrew convinced Nigel to lobby the chair at Illinois to offer me a 1-year visiting position, and he became my second postdoctoral mentor. I have many fond memories of my meetings with Nigel. Together we talked about deformations of Galois representations, the subject of his thesis, and we wondered about their implications for Ramanujan's mathematics, a direction I would take further with Ernest, which is what he talked about at his keynote speech when I met him at the conference of the ACMS. We teamed up to give seminars on theorems by Gross and Zagier and Kolivagin on the Birch and Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture. Nigel's door was always open, and I probably occupied more than my fair share of his time. I came of age as a number theorist in 1994 to 1995, the year I spent at Urbana-Champaign over pitchers of beer with my mentor and good friend Nigel Boston at a local pub called Joe's. Everyone needs help on their path to success. For me, Nigel Boston was the perfect catalyst as a second postdoctoral mentor. I later had the great privilege of having Nigel as a colleague for a few years at the University of Wisconsin. I was blessed to have had Nigel in my life. I don't know where I would be today had we not had those beers at Joe's 30 years ago. I thank you, Nigel Boston. Michael Bush and Farshid Hajir. As several of the pieces of this collection make clear, Nigel was a highly appreciated member of multiple research communities. Few mathematicians have had so much crossover appeal and influence through both their work and their mentoring of a large number of doctoral and postdoctoral trainees. Nigel mentored both of us, one more formally than the other, and later collaborated with us in a series of papers which represent some of the best and most widely circulated work we've done. We would like to share how, by bringing us together, he played such a decisive and positive role in our mathematical lives. FH. As a grad student at MIT, my advisor Harold Stark asked me to investigate the two-class field tower of the quadratic field of discriminant minus 2,379. It was a computational problem based on hope that by weakening the hypotheses of a theorem of Helmut-Koch, one might be able to show that the Odlyzko-Stark bounds on discriminant growth were extremely sharp. I was never able to settle that problem, but in the meanwhile it led to me to investigate a more theoretical problem Stark had posed about whether the p-rank of class groups in infinite p-class field towers always goes to infinity. While browsing in the Journal of Number Theory one day in 1992, I came across a paper of Nigel Boston providing the first supporting evidence for a conjecture of Fontaine and Mazur about the group theory of p-class tower groups. Fontaine and Mazur had made their conjecture some years earlier, but had not publicized it widely. It transpired that if true, the Fontaine-Mazur conjecture would confirm a positive answer to Stark's question on growth of ranks. I worked on writing up these observations and many more questions, and I handed a note to Nigel, whom I had never met. It was a thrill when he answered me right away and soon after invited me to visit him at UIUC, where he was about to be promoted to associate professor. I was a postdoc at the time. The visit to Urbana was a big milestone for me because from Nigel I learned a whole new set of techniques and ideas which were to serve me well for many years, including in recent collaborations with Christian Mayer and Ravi Ramakrishna. A few years later, I made another trip to Urbana and had a chance to meet Helmut Koch, who was visiting Nigel. At that time, MB was a second-year postgrad student. Over coffee one afternoon, I told Nigel about my failed attempts to compute the class field tower Stark had suggested might be infinite. Nigel had just developed a new technique with Lee M. Green for such computations that MB was perfecting. Nigel suggested we give the problem to a student. This time in the hands of a different graduate student, the problem succumbed to the new group theoretical techniques, but the answer was not the expected one. The class field tower is finite, and this became a part of MB's dissertation. MB. I first met Nigel when I took a topics course with him when I was starting out as a graduate student at UIUC in 1998. The course was intriguingly titled Arithmetic Geometry with Applications to Coding Theory, Cryptography, and Finance, and I found it fascinating but also difficult since I had only just enough background to follow along. After finishing my qualifying exams, I approached Nigel about potentially becoming my advisor, and he was enthusiastic and gave me some recent preprints and papers to read with who our ideas and computational methods in group theory were being used to attack various problems in number theory. This was followed a short time later by a problem to work on, which I later found out had come from FH. Nigel had already solved a slightly different problem and thought the same tools might be applied. After getting better acquainted with these tools, I was able to solve the problem, and this turned into my first paper as a grad student. Throughout my time in grad school, I found Nigel to be an incredibly supportive advisor. He often had 5 or more grad students working with him simultaneously during this period, but he would still manage to carve out time to meet with us individually each week. He was generous with his ideas and also had an extensive knowledge of the mathematical literature. If I was stuck, I would usually come away from a meeting with some new things to think about or papers to read that might be helpful. As I transitioned from grad student to postdoc, Nigel continued to have a positive influence by connecting me with several other mathematicians who later became collaborators. Some years later, Nigel suggested a new research program for the three of us to work on. The conjectures of Cohen and Lenstra describe probabilities for the occurrence of finite abelian groups as ideal class groups of number fields or of their PC those subgroups for fixed prime P. Since p-class tower groups are non-abelian analogs of p-class groups, Nigel's idea was to formulate a non-abelian Cohen-Lenstra type conjecture for the distribution of p-class tower groups. This seemed both exciting and daunting to the two of us, but Nigel seemed to see clearly that there were enough connections between group theory and number theory to make this work. Our first attempts hit a number of snags, but over several years we managed to formulate an exact conjecture and provide strikingly accurate predictions for various number theoretical calculations. Since then, the conjecture has been formulated and even proved in function field settings, and the ideas have been greatly generalized to a much broader class of profinite groups. It was such a pleasure to work with and spend time with Nigel. We also have wonderful memories of his wife, Susan, and daughters, Joanne and Jelana, as they grew up. One of them even helped us with some of the diagrams for our papers. It was a shock to lose Nigel so unexpectedly, but we are grateful to have been influenced by him so deeply in both mathematical and personal ways. Bernie Lesioter. I met Nigel when I joined the faculty in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Wisconsin in 2007. I soon learned that we overlapped at the University of Illinois decades before, though we never met there. We did share similar memories of Illinois, and I recall that he once used me as an Illinois graduate to settle a dispute about the regional pronunciation of Monticello, the small town nearest the site of the annual Allerton Conference. Thomas Jefferson might cringe at the regional pronunciation. Nigel was a friendly and generous colleague. When I expressed interest in a course he was teaching, cryptography, he quickly shared all his materials. Nigel could talk the jargon of electrical engineering and interpret many problems in a rigorous mathematical context. He was ever curious, and discussions often led to interesting problems. In my case, our discussions prompted trench research focused on the applied mathematics of polynomial systems and electrical power engineering. Our original contribution to this line of research was to study the geometry and distribution of the number of real-valued solutions over the space of possible values of electrical parameters. Additionally, to make the needed calculations, our students developed an approach to speed up the calculations of solutions exploiting symmetry in the model formulation. We were then able to estimate distributions in the number of real-valued solutions for several modest-sized power grids. To test the observation in the engineering literature that the number of real-valued solutions is small, we compared against the number of solutions that may be expected from a random polynomial of equal degree. We found that the power system models tend to admit more real-valued solutions than might be expected. While that number may be small compared to the total number of complex solutions, it never occurred to the engineers that the number might be considered large in a mathematical context. This was a welcome interpretation in the power engineering community. Also, our original work on calculating distributions of the number of solutions created a new subfield of study that has since been pursued by others. It was always a pleasure working with Nigel and our students, and I looked forward to our meetings. He was fun and genuinely loved his work, and that inspired all of us. David Conti. Just before I started my PhD in 2008, I learned that a brilliant mathematician would join University College Dublin and be my supervisor. I was excited but also nervous. Would I live up to his expectations? I visited his webpage, and there it was, a simple photo of Nigel with a cheerful look and no trace of anything austere or simulated. I was no longer nervous. When I then met him, I could appreciate his solar personality, an expression from Old Latin which also does justice to his constant emanation of positive energy, a remark he would have loved as he loved languages and etymology. Well, that's interesting. Thanks to his British roots, he had a smart sense of humor, too, which added to the pleasure of spending time with him. I was lucky to meet Nigel when I transitioned from pure to applied algebra. He was an all-rounder with a broad mathematical wisdom and command, which is rare in these days of over-specialization. His curriculum in math and engineering testifies to that. His versatility and multitasking kept impressing me throughout the years. I remember days when 2 work topics consumed my energies, only to see Nigel having multiple meetings and juggling 3 or more research topics with no effort. This all also had to do with his joy in interacting with people and his networking skills. It struck me how many contacts from disparate places and fields he had. Relatedly, he had 6 master's students, 39 PhD students, and 5 postdoctoral advisees. Despite his many engagements, he was never unresponsive or hasty in his advising. He would reply to my email typically on the same day, and his answers were always thoughtful. Often he would send me more emails with more thoughts. You could see he was thinking and caring about his students. Nigel proposed several directions for my PhD. One was an open conjecture on the optimality of a special graph representation of the Golay code, an exotic conjecture, but he was intrigued by it and even formulated a related conjecture. I was fascinated by his interest in a problem nobody else was working on, and I got hooked on it too. We couldn't solve the original conjecture, but I made several advances in uncharted terrain around it. He had the right intuition that the exotic problem would lead to prolific work. I could also prove his own conjecture, which was a special moment for both of us. At some stage, Nigel moved back to UW-Madison. I wanted to stay in Europe, so he offered to supervise me remotely and invited me to Wisconsin several times. He shared a lot of his time with me there. I vividly remember going to a bar with Nigel where he avidly watched a soccer match and yet was able to discuss deep math at the same time. In Wisconsin, I also got to know Susan, his lovely wife. I had much pleasure spending time with them together. They were a beautiful, harmonious couple, something I rarely saw. And so rare today. Thanks to this openness, we got to know each other very well during my PhD, and we kept in close contact. One of the things I admired most about him was that he was a free spirit. I learned about the Royal Society's nullius in verba motto from him. A few years ago, he decided to go into early retirement, and the bureaucratization of universities and loss of academic freedom played a significant role in that. And yet, he was a gentle spirit, always considerate and willing to listen to others, always intellectually honest, looking at things soberly and focusing on facts. It was a true privilege to have known Nigel and to be that close to him. He was not only a gifted and generous mathematician, but also a lively and honorable person. I learned a lot from him, and he meant a lot to me. My thoughts keep going, though, first of all to Susan and their daughters. His death is a tremendous loss, but what he has passed on is precious and remains and lives. Vefagaxel. I first met Nigel Boston in the summer of 2013 when I visited UW-Madison to work with him on an undergraduate research project. I was extremely fortunate to have the opportunity to meet him as an undergrad student, which had a huge positive effect on my view of mathematical research. We worked on a problem together which concerned iterates of polynomials over finite fields and later appeared in writing. This was when Nigel introduced me to the fascinating field of arithmetic dynamics. In 2014, I joined the maths graduate program at UW-Madison, and Nigel became my PhD advisor. As a natural extension of my undergrad work with him, my main PhD research focused on arboreal Galois representations, a terminology within arithmetic dynamics that Nigel introduced in the early 2000s. This terminology has been widely adopted by many authors over the past 2 decades. Nigel Boston and Ralph A. Jones published 3 joint papers on the subject, which played a crucial role in spurring intense research activity in the field. Their work has become foundational to the field and continues to influence much of the current research in the area. Nigel was always drawn to interdisciplinary problems, and I greatly admired his exceptional ability to use tools from seemingly disjoint areas to approach problems. He was an expert in applied algebra and held a joint appointment in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at UW-Madison. His ability to bring together ideas from different disciplines was evident not just in his applied work, but in his pure mathematics research as well. For example, his work with Ralph A. Jones involved tools from dynamics, number theory, group theory, and probability. He was also a true expert in using computational tools for mathematical research, particularly magma, and I was very fortunate to learn many of these tools from him, which continue to play an important role in my own research. Nigel was truly an extraordinary PhD advisor in every way imaginable. Despite his numerous commitments, supervising many students, collaborating on various projects, teaching, and service work, he made time to meet with each of us every week for hour-long sessions. I still find it difficult to understand how he managed to do it all. He was always incredibly responsive to my numerous mathematical emails, from which I learned a great deal. His mentorship went far beyond mathematics and academia. I remember many occasions when he gave me valuable advice on different aspects of life, advice that I continue to appreciate today. Nigel was also an avid Manchester United fan, and we enjoyed many lively conversations and email exchanges about soccer. His passion for Manchester United was so infectious that at one point I found myself rooting for them as well, unless they played against the Turkish team I supported. We stayed in touch after I graduated, and Nigel continued to offer me advice whenever I needed it. If we hadn't exchanged emails in a while, he would often check in to see how I was doing. I had planned to visit him in Florida at some point, but unfortunately that visit never came to be. I feel a deep sense of loss, not only for the brilliant mathematician we've lost, but for the kind, wise, and genuinely caring mentor who shaped so many of us. I miss him dearly. Jelena, Boston, Jackson. One of the hardest parts of losing my dad is knowing that my children will miss out on growing up with him in their lives. For 3 short years after my son's birth, I had the joy of watching my dad rediscover the playfulness and imagination I remembered so well from my own childhood. Grandpa and grandson were perfectly matched in silliness, and I'll always cherish memories of them blowing bubbles in the pool and crawling around on the floor, even with his bad knee, to build his Lego trains. Playing with children is a way to become a child once more yourself. It's wonderful. Figure 2, Nigel Boston and his family. It's a very beautiful family there, isn't it? My son's early love of numbers and his intense concentration while solving problems are a clear reflection of his grandpa's unique ability to turn anything into an engaging puzzle. Dad had a way of making each challenge feel like an adventure, something that had to be solved. I remember how my sister and I would teasingly give him complex math problems over dinner, knowing he wouldn't trust until he'd worked out the answer. My 8-year-old boy loves to do the same thing to me. Through this, he showed us the joy of using our minds and instilled in us the confidence that every problem has a solution as long as we approach it with patience and persistence. John Boston. My father is a teacher and he taught me many things: how to speak French, to drive a car, to understand calculus. He had a way of explaining things where they made sense, everything was logical, and he could always solve any problem he was presented with. I remember him telling me the story of Andrew Wiles solving Fermat's last theorem. He would describe it as being in a house full of rooms, and each room full of boxes. The solution to the problem was in one of these boxes, and Wiles had to search through every room, every box, until he found the solution. Many others would give up or not believe that the solution ever existed in this house at all, but Wiles persisted. This was one of Dad's best lessons: never give up on a solution. This lesson permeates my life, from my career to my personal life, the resolute belief that a solution always exists to a problem. I have friends or co-workers that will easily give up upon the issue off on someone else or accept that it is the way it is. For my dad, that was unacceptable. If he worked hard enough and truly believed in a solution, nothing was impossible. It is an attitude of determination, tenacity, and diligence. Leave no stone unturned. There are so many more amazing things I could share about my dad, but this was one of the best traits and a lesson he taught and showed me time and time again. Susan Boston. Nigel was very well loved all around the world. From the first date right up until the day he died, we never stopped having fun, expressing love for one another, and looking forward to the future together. Mostly I did not participate in Nigel's career life. Actually, I sometimes found myself at odds with the other life. Suffice it to say, he was always incredible as a professor, did whatever he could to help anybody who asked, and absolutely loved his students. He went the extra mile in all things he ever attempted, both in his professional and daily life. He never stopped doing research, which he loved. He was extremely gifted at teaching, no matter the audience. He would deal with the minutiae of administration, which he did not love, crossing every T and dotting every I. Nigel cared about outcomes and details more than any person I've ever met in my lifetime. He was generous, gentle, patient, kind, and giving almost to a fault. He was the most loving husband, helping me through a horrible illness over the years with his optimism, and we always said love is an action verb. He practiced it both with me and with John and Jelana. He adored them and was the best dad, always ready to help them with whatever they needed. I think he enjoyed their growing up years because he was like a kid himself when it came to fun. Yes, that is how to have fun with kids. Be a kid yourself. I wouldn't mind adding that he was there for both his parents in their old age and would fly over to see them as often as he could. He really did love them and worked hard to let them know how much he cared. Nigel and I prayed a lot for his students and colleagues whenever there was any mention of them in his dealings. He prayed every single day, 3 times a day. He had a great relationship with God. Well, that's a very interesting article, very inspirational. We should all try to be more like that as mathematicians, shouldn't we? That's all for now.